Welcome to Whispered Truth, where touching stories come alive. Let's jump into today's story.
David Larson stared at his reflection in the smudged train window, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. His once crisp white shirt was wrinkled, his tie askew, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. The rhythmic clatter of the subway car provided a fitting soundtrack to his scattered thoughts. Another late night at the office, another missed dinner with Sarah. He wondered if she'd even waited up this time. As the train lurched to a stop, David's gaze drifted to a woman huddled in the corner of the platform. Her weathered face and tattered clothes marked her as one of the city's many homeless, invisible to most of the bustling commuters. But something about her caught David's attention. Maybe it was the book clutched to her chest, or the way her eyes seemed to hold a spark of intelligence despite her circumstances. David hesitated as the door slid open. He was already late, and Sarah would be furious. But the woman's presence nagged at him, a splinter in his conscience he couldn't ignore. With a resigned sigh, he stepped off the train and approached her. "Excuse me," he said softly, crouching down to her level. "Are you all right? Do you need any help?" The woman looked up, startled. Her eyes, a striking shade of green, widened with a mix of fear and suspicion. "I'm fine," she mumbled, pulling her threadbare coat tighter around her thin frame. David fumbled in his pocket, extracting a crumpled $20 bill. "Here," he offered, holding it out. "Maybe this can help with a meal or something." The woman's gaze flicked between David's face and the money. After a moment's hesitation, she reached out with a trembling hand and took it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumble of another approaching train. David nodded, an inexplicable lump forming in his throat. He stood, brushing off his pants, and was about to turn away when a thought struck him. It was crazy, impulsive, and Sarah would probably kill him, but... "Listen," he said, fishing a business card from his wallet. "My company's having a party tomorrow night, free food, open bar if you want to come. Just show this at the door, no pressure, but you're welcome to join." The woman stared at the card as if it might bite her. David placed it gently on the ground beside her, then hurried towards the exit, his mind already racing with excuses for Sarah. As he climbed the stairs to the street, David couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just set something significant in motion. Little did he know how profoundly that simple act of kindness would change his life. Back on the platform, the woman picked up the card with trembling fingers. "David Larson," she read aloud, her voice catching. "Marketing Executive Thompson and Associates." A flicker of recognition passed across her face, followed by a mix of emotions too complex to name. She tucked the card carefully into her coat pocket, her green eyes now shimmering with unshed tears. The subway platform emptied as the last train of the night pulled away. In its wake, the woman sat alone, clutching her book to her chest like a shield. For the first time in months, a glimmer of hope sparked in her heart, and with it, a terror of what tomorrow might bring. The sleek lobby of Thompson and Associates buzzed with excitement. Employees in their finest attire mingled, the air filled with laughter and the clink of champagne glasses. David tugged at his collar, feeling out of place, despite the familiar surroundings. His argument with Sarah still echoed in his ears, her frustration at his chronic lateness, her accusation that he cared more about work than their relationship. He'd left the house in a fog of guilt and resentment, arriving at the party feeling more like a ghost than a guest. "Larson." A booming voice cut through David's brooding. Jack Thompson, the company's larger-than-life CEO, clapped a meaty hand on his shoulder. "There's my rising star. Where's that lovely wife of yours?" David forced a smile. "Sarah couldn't make it tonight, sir. She's not feeling well." Jack's jovial expression faltered for a moment. "Ah, That's a shame. Give her my best, won't you? He leaned in conspiratorially. Between you and me, David, I've got my eye on you for that new digital marketing initiative. Keep up the good work, and who knows, maybe next year you'll be hosting the shindig. As Jack moved on to glad hand other employees, David's forced smile faded. The promotion he'd been chasing for months suddenly felt hollow. He made his way to the bar, ordering a scotch he didn't really want. Quite a party, isn't it? David turned, nearly choking on his drink. The woman from the subway platform stood beside him, transformed. Her tangled hair was now neatly styled, and she wore a simple black dress that couldn't quite hide how thin she was. But it was her eyes that captivated him, those same striking green eyes, now alight with a mixture of amusement and apprehension. You came," David stammered, unable to hide his shock. She smiled, a brittle thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I clean up okay, don't I? Amazing what a hot shower and a borrowed dress can do." David's mind raced. What was he thinking? Inviting a homeless woman to a corporate party. He glanced around nervously, half expecting security to swoop in at any moment. "Relax," the woman said, picking up on his anxiety. "I won't embarrass you, I wanted to thank you for your kindness. It's been a long time since anyone looked at me like I was human." Something in her voice made David's chest tighten. "I'm David," he said, offering his hand. "And you are?" She hesitated, then took his hand. "Lisa," she said softly. "My name is Lisa." As they shook hands, a commotion near the entrance caught David's attention. A statuesque blonde woman had just arrived, causing a ripple of whispers and stares throughout the room. Even Jack Thompson seemed flustered, hurrying over to greet her. "Who's that?" David asked, more to himself than to Lisa. Lisa's grip on his hand tightened painfully. When David turned back to her, the color had drained from her face. "That," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling, "is Elizabeth Thompson, Jack's wife." David's brow furrowed in confusion. "But I thought, didn't she go missing 6 months ago?" Lisa finished, her green eyes locked on the blonde woman across the room. Yes, she did." As realization dawned, David felt the floor shift beneath his feet. He looked from Lisa to Elizabeth Thompson, and back again, his mind reeling. "Oh my God," he breathed. "You're—" Before he could finish, Lisa, or rather, Elizabeth grabbed his arm. "Please," she whispered urgently. "I need your help. There's so much you don't understand. I can't face them, not yet. Please, get me out of here." David's head spun. The missing wife of his CEO was standing before him, disguised as a homeless woman he'd invited to the party on a whim. His career, his future, possibly even his freedom hung in the balance of his next decision. As Elizabeth's pleading eyes bore into him, David made his choice. Taking her hand, he led her quickly towards a side exit, praying they wouldn't be noticed. Just as they reached the door, he heard Jack Thompson's voice boom across the room. "Elizabeth, Lizzie, is that you?" David's heart pounded as he pushed through the door, pulling Elizabeth into the cool night air. As it closed behind them, cutting off the sudden surge of voices from the party, he realized his life would never be the same. In the shadows of the alley, Elizabeth clung to David's arm, trembling. "Thank you," she whispered. "Now please, listen carefully. There's something you need to know, something that could bring down this entire company and put us both in terrible danger." David swallowed hard, the taste of scotch turning bitter in his mouth. Whatever Elizabeth was about to reveal, he had a sinking feeling it would make his argument with Sarah seem like a trivial squabble in comparison. As sirens wailed in the distance, he steeled himself for a truth that would shatter his world. The neon signs of a 24-hour diner cast an eerie glow over Elizabeth's face as she hunched over a steaming cup of coffee. David sat across from her, his own untouched mug growing cold, his mind still reeling from their hasty escape from the party. "Start from the beginning," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "What happened 6 months ago? Why did you disappear?" Elizabeth's fingers tightened around her cup. "It wasn't by choice," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I discovered something terrible about Jack, about the company." David leaned in, his heart racing. "What did you find?" "Embezzlement," Elizabeth said, her green eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and fear. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. There were offshore accounts, shell companies, and connections to some very dangerous people. David felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. "But Jack Thompson, he's always seemed so charismatic, philanthropic." Elizabeth finished bitterly. "It was all a facade, the charitable donations, the public image. It was all to cover up the rot at the core of Thompson and Associates." As Elizabeth spoke, memories began to surface in David's mind. Little inconsistencies he'd noticed over the years but dismissed. Budget discrepancies that were quickly smoothed over. Clients that seemed to appear out of nowhere, with contracts that bypassed normal channels. "When I confronted Jack," Elizabeth continued, her voice breaking, he didn't deny it. He tried to convince me it was for the greater good, that sometimes you had to bend the rules to achieve something meaningful. When I threatened to go to the authorities, She trailed off, her hands shaking so badly that coffee sloshed over the rim of her cup. David reached out instinctively, covering her hands with his own. "He had me committed," Elizabeth whispered. "To a private psychiatric facility, said I was having a nervous breakdown, that I was delusional. They kept me drugged, isolated. I don't know how long I was there, weeks, months, but I managed to escape. I've been living on the streets ever since, too afraid to go home, too ashamed to reach out to anyone." David's mind raced, trying to reconcile the Jack Thompson he thought he knew with this monstrous portrait Elizabeth was painting. But why come to the party tonight? Why risk being recognized? Elizabeth's eyes met his, filled with a fierce determination that took David aback. "Because I'm done hiding, I'm done being afraid. I've spent the last few months gathering evidence, making connections, and now I have everything I need to bring Jack down, to expose everything." A chill ran down David's spine. "Elizabeth, what are you planning?" Before she could answer, the diner's door chimed. David turned to see 2 men in dark suits enter, their eyes scanning the nearly empty restaurant. When their gaze landed on their table, David's blood ran cold. "We need to go," he said urgently, already sliding out of the booth. "Now." Elizabeth nodded, her face pale but resolute. As they hurried towards the back exit, David could hear heavy footsteps behind them. They burst out into a rain-slicked alley, the cold air a shock after the warmth of the diner. "This way," Elizabeth hissed, tugging David's arm. They ran through a maze of back streets, the sound of pursuit never far behind. David's lungs burned, his dress shoes slipping on the wet pavement. He had no idea where they were going, but he knew with certainty that his old life was receding with every step. Finally, Elizabeth pulled him into the shadow of a doorway, both of them panting heavily. As they caught their breath, she turned to him, her eyes bright in the darkness. "David," she said softly, "I'm so sorry. I never meant to drag you into this. You can still walk away, go home to Sarah. Pretend this never happened. I'll understand." David thought of Sarah, of the life they'd built together. The safe, comfortable existence that now seemed like a distant dream. Then he thought of Jack Thompson's booming laugh, of the promotion dangled before him like a carrot. Of all the times he'd stayed late at the office, chasing a success that now felt hollow and tainted. No, he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. I'm in this now, whatever you're planning, whatever it takes to expose the truth. I want to help. Elizabeth's expression softened, a glimmer of hope breaking through her fear. Thank you, she whispered. But you need to understand from this moment on, nothing will ever be the same. Are you sure you're ready for that? As distant sirens pierced the night, David met Elizabeth's gaze. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of his own determination, his own need for redemption. Whatever came next, he knew he couldn't turn back now. I'm ready, he said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. What's our next move? Elizabeth's lips curved into a grim smile. We're going to need help, she said. And I know just where to start. But David, it's going to be dangerous. Are you absolutely certain you want to do this? As the weight of his decision settled over him, David took a deep breath. His old life, the safety, the predictability, the moral compromises was behind him now. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the chance to finally do something that mattered. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, he said. Elizabeth nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and resolve. Then let's go, she said, taking his hand. We've got a long night ahead of us. As they slipped back into the rainy night, David felt a surge of adrenaline. For better or worse, his life had irrevocably changed. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was what he'd been waiting for all along. The pre-dawn light cast long shadows as David and Elizabeth huddled in a booth at an all-night internet cafe. The glow of the computer screen illuminated their tired faces as Elizabeth's fingers flew across the keyboard. There, she muttered, hitting the enter key with a sense of finality. It's done. David leaned in, squinting at the screen. What exactly did you just do? Elizabeth sat back, rubbing her eyes. I've sent encrypted files to every major news outlet in the country, financial records, communication logs, everything I managed to gather before Jack had me committed. It's all out there now. A mixture of exhilaration and terror coursed through David's veins. So that's it, it's over? Elizabeth shook her head grimly. Not even close. This is just the opening salvo. Jack has powerful friends. David, they'll try to bury this, discredit the sources. We need to keep pushing, keep the story alive. As if on cue, David's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, his heart sinking as he saw Sarah's name on the screen. With a guilty glance at Elizabeth, he answered. David, where are you? I've been worried sick. Sarah's voice was a mixture of relief and anger. I'm okay, Sarah. Something's happened at work. I can't really explain right now, but... Can't explain? Sarah cut him off, her voice rising. David, there are police at our house. They're asking questions about you, about your involvement in some kind of financial scandal. What's going on? David closed his eyes, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I promise I'll explain everything soon. But right now, I need you to trust me. Can you do that? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was quiet, resigned. I don't know if I can, David. I don't even know who you are anymore. The call ended with a click, leaving David staring at his phone, a hollow ache in his chest. Elizabeth reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. I'm sorry, she said softly. I never meant for any of this to happen. David pocketed his phone, pushing down the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. It's not your fault, he said. I made my choice. Now we need to see it through. As they left the cafe, the city was beginning to stir. News vans clustered outside the Thompson and Associates building, reporters jockeying for position. David and Elizabeth watched from across the street as Jack Thompson pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of controlled anger as he issued terse, no comments. "He's scared," Elizabeth murmured. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed as she watched Jack Thompson disappear into the building. "He's scared," she murmured. "But he's also dangerous. We need to be careful." David nodded, his mind racing. "What's our next move?" Before Elizabeth could answer, a hand clamped down on David's shoulder. He whirled around, heart pounding, to find himself face to face with Marcus Chen, the company's head of IT. "David, what the hell is going on?" Marcus hissed, his eyes darting between David and Elizabeth. "The office is in chaos. There are rumors flying everywhere, and—" He stopped abruptly, his gaze settling on Elizabeth. "Wait a minute, aren't you?" "Marcus," David said quickly. "We need your help, but not here. It's not safe." Marcus hesitated, confusion and concern warring on his face. Finally, he nodded. "My apartment's not far, we can talk there." As they followed Marcus through the awakening city, David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every passing car, every pedestrian with a phone seemed a potential threat. By the time they reached Marcus's small, cluttered apartment, David's nerves were frayed to breaking point. Once inside, Marcus turned to them, arms crossed. "All right, start talking. What's really going on?" Over the next hour, Elizabeth laid out the whole sordid tale: the embezzlement, the dangerous connections, her forced commitment, and her months on the streets. Marcus listened in stunned silence, his face growing paler with each revelation. "Jesus," he breathed when Elizabeth finished. "I knew something was off with some of the accounts, but this is beyond anything I imagined." "We need your help, Marcus," David said earnestly. "You have access to the company's systems. There must be more evidence we can uncover, something to corroborate Elizabeth's story." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, conflict clear in his eyes. "What you're asking, it's not just unethical, it's illegal. I could lose everything." "We're all risking everything," Elizabeth said softly. "But if we don't act, think of how many more people Jack and his associates will hurt." A tense silence fell over the room. David could almost see the gears turning in Marcus's head, weighing the risks against his conscience. Finally, Marcus sighed heavily. "All right," he said. "I'll help, but we do this smart. I have a secure setup in the spare room. We'll work from there." As Marcus led them to his makeshift command center, David's phone buzzed again. This time it was a news alert. His stomach dropped as he read the headline: "Thompson and Associates CEO denies allegations, claims whistleblower is mentally unstable." "He's moving fast," David muttered, showing the others. "We need to work faster." For the next several hours, they pored over data, cross-referencing Elizabeth's evidence with what Marcus could safely access from the company's servers. As the pieces started to fall into place, a picture emerged that was even darker than David had imagined. It wasn't just embezzlement, there were hints of money laundering, connections to organized crime, even potential ties to human trafficking. This is huge," Marcus said, his voice hushed with a mixture of awe and horror. "If we can prove even half of this—" A sharp knock at the door cut him off. They froze, exchanging panicked glances. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Marcus Chen," a muffled voice called. "This is the police. We have some questions about your involvement with Thompson and Associates." "Shit," Marcus hissed. He turned to David and Elizabeth, his eyes wide with fear. "There's a fire escape through the bedroom. Go, I'll stall them." "Marcus, we can't just leave you." David started, but Marcus cut him off. "Go," he insisted. What you have is too important. I'll be fine. Just be careful and good luck. With a last grateful look at Marcus, David and Elizabeth slipped out onto the fire escape. As they descended, David could hear the muffled sound of Marcus talking to the police. He prayed their friend would be okay. They emerged into an alley behind the building, hearts pounding. "We need to move," Elizabeth said urgently. "It won't take them long to figure out we were there." As they hurried through the back streets, dodging curious glances from passers-by, David's mind raced. They had the evidence now, but how could they use it? Who could they trust? Suddenly, Elizabeth grabbed his arm, pulling him to a stop. "David," she said, her voice tight with fear. "Look." He followed her gaze to a newspaper stand across the street. His own face stared back at him from the front page, alongside a headline that made his blood run cold: "Manhunt underway for disgraced executive and missing CEO's wife." As sirens wailed in the distance, David met Elizabeth's eyes. They were no longer just whistleblowers, they were fugitives. And as the net tightened around them, David realized that their fight for the truth had just become a fight for survival. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth's grip on his arm tightened, her eyes blazing with determination. "We finish this," she said firmly. "No matter what it takes." As they melted back into the crowd, David knew that the final confrontation was coming. And when it did, everything would change for better or for worse. The abandoned warehouse loomed before them, a hulking shadow against the setting sun. David's heart pounded in his chest as he and Elizabeth approached, their footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. "Are you sure about this?" he whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Elizabeth nodded grimly. "This is where Jack conducts his less savory business dealings. If we're going to find the final piece of evidence we need, it'll be here." The past 48 hours had been a blur of close calls and desperate measures. They'd narrowly escaped capture multiple times, relying on a network of unlikely allies, from a sympathetic journalist to a former employee with a grudge against Jack. Each encounter had brought them closer to the truth, but also heightened the danger they faced. As they slipped through a broken window, David couldn't help but think of Sarah. He'd managed to get a message to her through Marcus, explaining everything. Her response had been brief but gave him hope. "Be careful, I love you." Inside the warehouse, they moved cautiously through a maze of crates and abandoned machinery. Elizabeth led the way, her movements sure despite the dim light. Finally, they reached a metal door set into the far wall. "This is it," Elizabeth murmured, pulling out a small device Marcus had given them. "If Jack's keeping any physical evidence, it'll be behind this door." As she worked on bypassing the electronic lock, David kept watch, every shadow seeming to conceal a potential threat. Finally, with a soft beep, the lock disengaged. They entered a small office, its walls lined with filing cabinets. Elizabeth immediately began rifling through drawers, while David booted up an ancient computer in the corner. "Anything?" Elizabeth asked after several tense minutes. David shook his head, frustration mounting. "Nothing concrete, some questionable financial records, but nothing we don't already." He broke off as a file name caught his eye. "Wait, this is, oh my God." Elizabeth hurried over, peering at the screen. Her face paled as she read the document. "It's a list of names, dates, locations." "Human trafficking," David said, his voice hollow. "This is proof that Jack's been facilitating human trafficking." Elizabeth's hands clenched into fists. "We need to copy this now." As David fumbled with a USB drive, a slow clap echoed through the room. They whirled around to find Jack Thompson standing in the doorway, flanked by two burly men. "I have to hand it to you," Jack said, his voice dripping with false admiration. "You've been quite the thorn in my side these past few days." "It's over, Jack," Elizabeth said, her voice steady despite the fear David could see in her eyes. "We have everything. The authorities are on their way." Jack's smile didn't waver. "Oh, I doubt that very much. You see, I own half the police force in this city and the other half, well, let's just say they're more interested in catching two fugitives than listening to wild accusations." He stepped further into the room, his genial mask slipping to reveal the cold, calculating man beneath. "I'll make you a deal. Hand over all the evidence you've gathered, and I'll make sure you're both taking care of a comfortable life, far away from here. What do you say?" David glanced at Elizabeth, saw the resolve in her eyes, and knew his answer. "We'll take our chances with the justice system, thanks." Jack's expression hardened. "Have it your way." He nodded to his men. "Take care of them. Make it look like an accident." What happened next was a blur of motion and adrenaline. As the men advanced, David grabbed a heavy paperweight from the desk and hurled it at the nearest thug. Elizabeth upended a filing cabinet, sending papers flying and creating a momentary distraction. They bolted for the door, shoving past a startled Jack. Behind them, they could hear angry shouts and pounding footsteps. They raced through the warehouse, dodging obstacles and praying they wouldn't hit a dead end. Just as they burst out of the building, a police siren cut through the night. For a moment, David's heart sank, thinking Jack's corrupt officers had arrived. But then he saw Marcus step out of the lead car, accompanied by a stern-looking woman in a FBI jacket. "David, Elizabeth," Marcus called. "It's okay, they're here to help." As more cars pulled up, David and Elizabeth sagged against each other in relief. They watched as Jack and his men were led out in handcuffs, the CEO's face a mask of impotent rage. The FBI agent approached them, her expression a mix of admiration and concern. "I'm Agent Ramirez. We've been building a case against Thompson for months, but your evidence was the key to bringing him down. You've done a great service, but you've also taken incredible risks." David nodded wearily. "What happens now?" "Now," Agent Ramirez said, "you both need to come with us. There's a lot of explaining to do, and a lot of paperwork in your future, but I think I can safely say that your days of running are over." As they were led to a waiting car, David felt the weight of the past few days finally hit him. He turned to Elizabeth, seeing his own exhaustion and relief mirrored in her face. "We did it," he said softly. Elizabeth smiled, a genuine radiant smile that transformed her face. "We did. Thank you, David, for everything." As the car pulled away from the warehouse, David leaned back, closing his eyes. The future was uncertain. There would be trials, testimonies, and no doubt some difficult conversations with Sarah. But for the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace. They had faced their fears, exposed the truth, and in doing so, had changed not just their own lives, but potentially countless others. Whatever came next, David knew he could face it with his head held high. As the city lights blurred past the window, David allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes, he realized, the most unexpected encounters could lead to the most profound changes. And sometimes, doing the right thing meant taking the hardest path.
Hey, want to listen to another best story? Then click the floating video and subscribe for more.